ton of sugar, there is a labor component.
How much worse off, let's say, is a sugar laborer in Negros compared to, let's say, a rice farmer in Bulacan or a corn farmer in Bukidnon?
It's no question that sugar farming is hard work. It's no question that loading that sugar in the hot sun is hard work.
Wherever you have sugar, you really need two kinds of people. You need people who are on opposite ends of the social scale. One to provide the capital and one to provide the work or the labor.
But if you pay well, what's wrong with it? We are capitalists. There's no argument. Problem is, not all pay well.
You know, sugar is still the #1 source of calorie, therefore energy, human energy.
It's the cheapest carbohydrate in the world. Carbohydrate by carbohydrate, it's the cheapest.
Sugar is very important because the population of the United States is 300 plus million. Just look at the soft drink industry, the food processing industry that involves sugar. It just keeps going up the way the population goes up, and we export a lot of this stuff.
There should be increased production. Why? Because we are a growing population, 90 million Filipinos, 6 billion worldwide, and everybody needs sugar. That's the cheapest source of energy.
When Hitler went to war, when he invaded Poland, after that he gave 10 products to his economic ministers that they should never run out of. Number 1 was fuel. You know what was one of the 10? Sugar. That tells you something about the importance of sugar.
My uncle once said, when the sugar industry sneezes, the island gets a cold. Negros is the only place in the Philippines where all you'll see are endless sugarcane farms. Here, sugar is king. I've come home after many years to tell the real story of sugar, growing up in Hacienda and having grown up in Negros Island. Is it a sunset industry? Is it oppressive? What is the real story of the sacadas?
When the lands of Negros were opened, there were not enough people to harvest the cane. So they would go to other islands. Biggest among them at that time was Panay, which had big populations. Or from here, there were Cebuanos speaking, they would go to Bantayan, etc. and get sacadas. They would give a cash advance, bring them, they would work 6 months, 8 months, and go back. What is a sacada? If the real term of a sacada, it comes from this word, Spanish word, to get from somewhere else. Sacada is to get. A sacada is a migrant laborer that you bring into your place because you do not have laborers in your place to do a certain manual task.
Muroy lives in Cadiz, 2 hours away from Bacolod City. He is a widower. When he is away to work during the milling season, his mother takes care of his children. His father was also a sacada who came all the way from Antique, a province in the island of Panay.
Cinta lang ading adlaw. Taglay pa ang iladin adlaw laka malang laban takyaw.
Amo na nga gakadto ka to.
Kasi mana lang mo tag 200 ang simana mo di.
Sa kasimanat?
Oo. Sila ba na pakyaw na nang berarti gadlaw lang sa 30 talaga. Di mo na nga way sa ka pangayaya agobra. Ang una, isang saldariaga diri kami regular. Sis kami dia kay ti kami gintaw sa una di mo.
So Dumaan ka mo sa una ni Saldariaga.
Kami sa unang Dumaan di.
Sang iya ti at simpo kay ti ya.
Oo, kaya pa.
Sila ti ang pinabayad. Sila nga
Diba dia sa una sinang adlaw tawo sang 130. Kay karon kay napasang insect. Di way na. Haram balay ko gani. Nalibo na ganin balay ko eh.
Ano?
Nalibo na ganin. Hilamon kay daka lang napulian. Nga akong bugtong to, sir. Samayo ko sir, okay, kalutag sir mo. Ano sabihin? Ha? Ito sa kay Lulayas Mabini.
Ilan ni edad nila yun?
14.
They came because where they are, or these people live, there was no source of income. Eventually, those Sakadas stayed behind. Why did they stay behind? They stayed behind because the earning opportunity in Negros was better than back home. These are not native Negrenses. They came here. When they came here, why did they stay? Because life was better.
Mercelina Dolor. Her family has been working at Hacienda Chiquita as Dumaan, regular workers who live in the farm.
Mayo man ang iya pagdumala sa amon. So, gin pahulam niya kami sa adulta nga ginahimo namon bala cooperative namon. May project kami nga iya ng cooperative, may tanaman kami nga tubo. Amo na bali ang luwas sa sweldo namon kung gaindra kami sa cooperative, amo nang bilang extra namon lang income. Amo na sang nagabulig-bulig man sa amon kapin pagid ang project namon sa humay. Kung gaindra kami sa co, may project kami sa humay, dason magkapaani kami, may bugas kami ya. Amo na nagabulig-bulig sa amon. Sang bataon pa ko. Ala ka namin sang handom kuya. Gusto ko ya ma-start ko sa subdivision. Yan na balang nang daganin sa mga gay ko may bahay kalinga da balaw. Bisan na mula na gusto ko da mag-start kay kanami sa mga plastada bala ka mga balay hindi pareho sa Shinda.
Moroy Junco and Mercelina Dolor work for one of the most socially responsible farms in Negros, Hacienda Chiquita in EB Magalona. This farm is run by Mrs. Gina Martin. She manages her family's farms and rents other farms as well. After college in Manila, Gina went home to Negros and witnessed the hard life of farm workers. She joined feeding programs as a social worker.
I wasn't really effective because their main problem would be at that time wages. You know, it wasn't enough, and there was no land. We were only just thinking of hog raising. The livelihood was not really sufficient for them. Then until I started to present myself to my father, my dad said, "Why don't you try to manage and help him out?" Which I did. Then I saw the difference that I could be more of help if I was in the management of the business. The relationship I had with the people was really of wanting to help, at the same time shifting from being like a social worker to a helper or a teacher to becoming a manager, but still being challenged to become more efficient. Because the more I became a manager managing the corporation, then I realized that I could use less of them if I would want to make more money, and so the factor of the labor became such a challenge to me, which made me more involved in foundations that would provide alternative livelihood and business for them.
For years, Alberto and Nympha Dalgontas worked as Dumaan in a hacienda in the town of La Castellana. In 2001, they became Agrarian Reform Beneficiaries, ARBs, and received land of their own.
Diyan lang imo duta.
Ario 35 oras niya lang dito na punta mo na pato deo. Pato uno 16 to mo. Katiak sa suba bla nagyan sang suba. Matupa lang nga sa Tariana. Ario uno 16. Kung ibisay kagang 35 Koreas, naamo na siya.
Sa pilatanan.
Bali uno media. Eh, nang labapas la?
Para o?
Sila ka mo di kay Star?
Siyam. Ang bugas namon ginadawat pakada semana tunga sa gana ay tunga sa sako. Tapos hindi na gani kami kabakal kun ano bugas lang ginapalabi namon, di na kami kabakal sang amon sulod balay. Di kung kisana mapuli na lang kung nagani ang kung kisana bisan isda wala na lang kung gina ang importante lang yan nga kung ginaano yung bugas nga ang kabataan ko hindi magutman.
The future of Moroy, Gina, Mercelina, Alberto, Nympha, and millions of others in my province lie on the productivity of one single crop, sugarcane. An archipelago of 7,107 islands. Before the first colonizers set foot on these Pacific islands, land was owned by the community, not by individuals. A person wasn't allowed to claim ownership of land, only the produce that he cultivated from it. Uncharted fertile land. A people unchristianized and uneducated. These attracted Ferdinand Magellan to claim for Spain the ownership of the islands, of what is known as the Philippines. To deal with the vast land area in their hands, the Spanish colonizers adopted the encomienda system of Mexico. They abolished the old concept of land for all and imposed a new one, land titling. Natives became mere tenants, while friars gave out land to those who brought gifts or paid taxes. Some of these parishioners ventured into an agricultural industry which would soon shape the social and economic life of Filipinos. As early as the 1600s, the Filipino was processing unrefined sugar in manual mills. What dominated the simple sugar manufacturing in private estates was the molino de sangre, made of wood, bamboo, and stone, aptly called the machine of blood because it was driven by a farmhand or a water buffalo. Other mills also included the molino de agua or hydro mill, run by a giant wheel on water. After less than a century, the Philippines was exporting sugar to China, Spain, and India. By the end of the 1700s, it was Asia's largest producer of sugar. It was the start of an all-time sugar high. Large plantations, haciendas, sprouted in Manila, Laguna, and Batangas. Luzon landowners realized a viable economic strategy: leased their lands to farmer tenants in a 50-50 scheme. The ownership of large haciendas spread far south to the Visayan provinces. But here, the daily wage system was enforced, a system which would earn criticism in the years to come. The Visayan sugar scene first thrived in Iloilo, then nearby Panay, and across the sea in Negros. Nicholas Loney, the first British vice consul to Iloilo, saw the need for large-scale sugar production in Panay and Negros. Loney paved the way for the modernization of the Visayan sugar industry and established a credit system, the first crop loan, to farmers. He enticed European businessmen and financing companies to invest in his newfound enterprise. By connecting the Guimaras Wharf near Iloilo to the Pulupandan Wharf in Negros, he opened shipping and trade between the two provinces. He located vast markets for sugar overseas, shipping from the Iloilo port of call to Australia and New Zealand. Successful in his trade investments, Loney convinced Iloilo planters to invest in vast tracts of Negros land, cheaper and more fertile than those in their hometown. This started the 1857 exodus of Iloilo sugar families to Negros Occidental. By then, a French national, Yves Leopold Germain Gaston, transferred to Silay in Negros from the Rojas Sugar Estate in Batangas, Luzon. He brought with him the Horno Economico, the first iron mill in Negros, which increased his sugar production compared to other sugarcane farmers. the Philippines became the world's third largest sugarcane producer. Negros Island became the country's largest sugarcane producer. A few years shy of the 20th century, Negros haciendas were larger than anywhere in the country, ranging from 100 to 700 hectares. By then, the Negrense sugar elite had signified their presence in Philippine society. This was confirmed by the stone houses or bahay na bato of Negros, mostly in Bago, Talisay, Bacolod, and Silay. In these opulent houses, they created the parties which they became controversially known for. This lavish lifestyle was best represented in the iconic image of the Negrense haciendero, clad in white, cane in hand. And this was the image the Americans saw when they landed on the shores of Negros Island by the turn of the 20th century. For the next 40 years, it was a roller coaster ride for the Filipino. From the Philippine Revolution, to the Philippine-American War, to the Japanese occupation, the Negrense haciendero was not spared. The hacienderos united in protecting their interests against the American colonizers. In 1898, the United States offered to pay Spain $20 million when it ceded the Philippines. The Americans regarded the Philippine sugar industry as a threat to their interests in Cuba and Hawaii. They imposed taxes to sugar imported by the Philippines. But under the Payne-Aldrich tariff, an increase of 100% of sugar export from the Philippines entered American shores. The capitalist Americans saw the huge potential of the Philippine sugar industry and invested in mills. The Negrense haciendero initially resisted the establishment of modern mills which would process refined sugar for the world market. They also opposed the sharing scheme between themselves and the millers. The newly opened Philippine National Bank, or PNB, offered crop loans to hacienderos. PNB also financed 5 of the 6 giant milling companies in the country. These 5 companies were, of course, in Negros. The hacienderos, eager for means to boost their capital investments for the new milling system, clung to these crop loans in the same way their daily wage laborers depended on cash advances from their haciendero landlords. Meanwhile, the class struggle between haciendero and sugar worker continued. As early as 1936, a call for communism was sounded, a call which both the hacienderos and the sugar workers heard. But the lure of Uncle Sam's greenbacks proved to be too much for the hacienderos. When the first international sugar agreement was passed, they reluctantly gave in. They lost no time in assimilating the ropes of capitalism from the Americans. The sugarcane workers benefited from this. Their wage rate became the highest in all agricultural industries. Under the Stars and Stripes, the affluent Negros sugar elite was reborn. But their elation was short-lived. When the Japanese occupied the Philippine archipelago in 1941, the hacienderos united against the threat of a new colonizer eager to strip their island of its natural wealth. The Japanese needed alcohol from sugarcane to fuel their war machines. They controlled PNB and disbursed crop loans to the hacienderos. The hacienderos accepted the crop loans but secretly sabotaged their own sugar mill equipment and burned their own farms. In the south of Negros, renegade guerrilla units disguised as revolutionaries raided and set fire to the grandest of hacienda homes, while hacienderos supported the real guerrilla movement with money, food, and supplies. Then Bacolod Mayor Alfredo Montelibano Sr., with the help of other prominent hacienderos, organized guerrilla units in the mountains of Negros. The sugar industry suffered tremendously during the Second World War. By 1945, only 5 sugar mills in the country were operational, with a measly production of 12,000 tons. the war brought forth a surprising turn to the strained relationship between millers and hacenderos. Both parties agreed to cooperate for the rehabilitation of the ravaged mills and haciendas. A friendly sharing scheme was agreed upon by both parties. In 3 years, the number of productive sugar mills rose to 23. The hacenderos' loyalty to the Commonwealth and the United States was not left unrecognized. The National Federation of Sugar Planters secured government posts for Negrense politicians. This started the Sugar Bloc, one of the most powerful industry-related political groups in the country. The Pearl of the Orient Seas, 1946. Basking in the glory of its newfound independence, after more than 400 years of power under the flags of 3 foreign sovereigns, the U.S. government offered a paltry $800,000 to the ravaged islands as gratuity for war damages. Sugar production in Negros rose to greater heights, not because of progressive production techniques, but because of the rampant grabbing of untilled land in the mountains and forests of the island, all to be transformed into haciendas. The Parity Rights Trade Agreement brought heaven and hell to the island of Negros. Heaven in the guise of the sugar quota, hell in the rape of the island's natural forests. What the Philippines lost in terms of war damages, it got back through special treatment from the Americans. This proved to be true and beneficial for the sugar industry. The Laurel-Langley Agreement gave the hacendero his sweet dreams, a premium selling price, and a guaranteed quota. Every year for 19 years. History taught the hacendero that there is a price, figurative or real, to everything. $20 million for the Treaty of Paris, sugar quotas, trade agreements. So you ask, what is the price of sugar in a cup of coffee? At the current price of 60 pesos a kilo, 2 teaspoonfuls in a cup is roughly 50 centavos, the price of a piece of candy. For sugar from plant to reach your table, the basics of agriculture, economics, and trade combine to form a complex process. Let's take a 5-hectare sugar farm. A lot of sugarcane farms still employ cane burning as the first step of the cultivation or cultivo process. This makes it cheaper to prepare the land without the trash. The tractors do not have to thrash the cane leaves and can go straight to plowing and harrowing to aerate the soil for easy planting. Tractors are very important because they go deep in breaking the soil. Cane cuttings come in different varieties, a planter's choice detrimental to his sugar production. 70,000 average cane points will be planted in 1 hectare. In a 5-hectare farm, 350,000 will be planted by 8 workers. Irrigation can be done through river tapping or the artificial sprinkler system. In periods of drought or no rain, this process is most costly to the planter. For a TASOC system, where water is tapped from a deep water source, 20,000 pesos is the usual rate. Chemical fertilizer application may be the highest expense in the cultivo stage. So to cope with its rising cost, the planter tends to lessen the number of bags per hectare. Insecticides are sprayed to cane plants to get rid of pests and borers. On average, for 3 to 4 months, the farm is left untouched. Only minor work is required, so workers are wageless. They borrow from the hacendero and pay when the harvest season starts. This is the dead season, locally called Tiempo Muerto. Workers wait for the cane to mature to certain purity level. At the right level, sugar content is high, making for higher yield. This cane purity level is called Pureza. 7 sacadas can cut and load 10 tons gross cane weight per day, enough to fill up a medium-sized cane truck. The harvested cane should now be immediately sent to the sugar mill. A delay of 3 to 5 days from cutting to milling can be damaging to the pureza or purity and sugar content of the harvested cane. The truck and its cane load are then weighed in the sugar mill. The cane is chopped, washed, shredded, crushed, evaporated, crystallized, a complex process resulting in raw sugar. The sugar in our coffee, refined white sugar. Sugar in 50-kilogram bags are transported to various trade markets. The planter receives sheets of kedan receipts from the sugar mill. Each milling season utilizes classifications of sugar, all of which have different prices. He then trades his kedans for cash. Sold to different markets around the world, sugar is then used in a multitude of products, from food to beverages to medicine, beauty products, even pesticides, and would you believe, fabric? But the more significant question in this film is, what is the real price of sugar? What price must be paid for the sugar in your cup of coffee? I grew up partly in a small town known with one of the most fertile soil in Negros, Isabela. One of my memories as a kid is being thrown from the bed to the floor in the middle of the night by my dad to protect us because a few blocks away there was gunfire between the military and the NPA. I grew up seeing farms burned. You can't travel after sundown. It was just too dangerous. People got killed right and left. And these were people we knew. Fathers of our friends. Fathers of kids we played with at school. In the late 60s, an armed revolution was slowly taking roots in the countryside, aimed at championing the rights of the working class, especially in agricultural areas across the country. The NPA, or New People's Army, the militant wing of the Communist Party of the Philippines, established a stronghold in the southern towns of Negros Occidental, especially for the Chicks area, for the towns of Kawayan, Hinobaan, Ilog, Candoni, Kabangkalan, and Sipalay.
When there's poverty, there's injustice. It was ripe for any movement that would espouse equality, better life.
The leaders of the sugar, the people who are always in the forefront of the sugar industry, became identified with an abusive regime. When people are oppressed, when people are abused, rebellion always thrives.
Workers raised issues vital to their living and working conditions. The military, controlled by President Ferdinand E. Marcos, and the rebels battled it out in South Negros. But another form of revolution was taking place, this one non-violent and headed by Catholic priests.
The basic Christian communities that we were involved in, one of the very strong components was community organizing. They called it BCCCO. And it was around issues in the community, like water, land. We had a very strong education programs in the Christian communities. So the two pillars on which we built the basic Christian communities was the sense of dignity and a need for organization or community building.
Militancy in the streets and insurgency in the mountains. Anarchies that President Ferdinand Marcos claimed were the reasons for his declaration of martial law in 1972. The Marcos regime was famed for its suppression of democracy and political dissent. Marcos created monopolies in many industries. Some of them were put under government control: telecommunications, the media, electrification, agriculture.
Monopoly, plunder,
Dictatorship.
Murders.
Corruption.
dictatorship,
Marcos. People here used to call it crony capitalism. Cardinal Sin used to tell visitors, the main business here in the Philippines run by President and Mrs. Marcos is mining. And when you would ask him, what does that mean? He said, well, it's very easy. They say, that's mine, and that's mine, and that's mine, and that's mine.
Marcos embarked on a large-scale invasion of the sugar industry in Negros, from mill construction to sugar pricing. PhilSucom, or the Philippine Sugar Commission, was tasked to control international and domestic sugar trading through NASUTRA, or the National Sugar Trading Corporation. RPB, the Republic Planters Bank, became the lending institution for the sugar industry. Both PhilSucom and RPB were headed by one man, Roberto S. Benedicto, or RSB. No wonder RSB was called the Sugar Czar. A majority of Negrense planters had taken the Marcos RSB bait, mortgaging their land to the banks to fund their lavish lifestyle. At first, the invasion of Marcos cronies was widely welcomed by planters. They enjoyed wining and dining with the Marcos government. In the end, the planters realized they were taken for a spin, a wild one in which they were left losers.
I think when things started going wrong, and then the government was no longer helping us, we never thought it would get that bad.
A lot of people in the industry felt this was the solution. And then it turned out that this was the formula to plunder.
They thought, no. They thought that the sugar industry will never die.
The people seem to forget what the Marcos did to the sugar industry.
I could have gone amok and killed Marcos.
He held the sugar industry captive but made it a milking cow. So what happened was that, with the collusion of Roberto Benedicto, who is also one of our own kind.
They're partly at fault. Amot ang imo kraplon, bakal ka auto nga banggo na nung himo mo abi.
It was partly our fault that we acted as if we owned the world.
When the Laurel-Langley Agreement expired in 1974, it took with it the Philippines' U.S. sugar quota. The Negros sugar industry was forced to compete in the highly aggressive but volatile world market, an event it was unprepared for. NASUTRA played on the uptrend as the world prices kept on going up. And then, the unpredictable happened. Only 3 years after the expiration of the Laurel-Langley Agreement, sugar prices dropped from a high of 65 US cents per pound to a measly 6 cents per pound. The sugar world market collapsed. Sugar was stored in swimming pools, warehouses, schools, and churches. Hacienderos left a large area of their sugarcane plantations unattended and unharvested.
Why can't I be given the life that I was trained to live? Why must I go somewhere? Why must my heart be torn?
Way before traveling, you travel so that you enjoy outside the island and not here. something like that. You don't. But then again, we earned it. So there's this. It's a very ambivalent situation. I grew up into it. My father always likes the good life. And it's super charming, with all the vices. We had houses in Manila, in America. 2, 3 houses one time. House in Baguio, house in... Nawala siya.
Much like most of Negros families, mine traveled around America for a few years as our farms back home were planted only for our workers' subsistence. Save for a few, our families were in debt as we enjoyed the good life. Most of these families still have pending crop loans from the Marcos years.
My father will have to forgive me, but our lifestyle at that time could not anymore be supported by how the income was coming in from sugar to just cash crops, which is not enough. And so we had to borrow, and then there was like a mismanagement. And so we were totally indebted.
And true to Negrense form, to lift the spirits of their sugar island, a festival of colorful smiling masks was created in the capital, Bacolod City. Who else would envision a Mardi Gras festival as an answer to tragedy and widespread economic devastation, but the fun-loving, party-going Negrenses? The Mascara Festival was a social anesthesia, especially for the masses. Behind their smiling, happy mask, the sugarcane laborers still remained poor. The clergy of the Roman Catholic Church was a steadfast force which leaned towards the plight of these workers.
On one side, we had to buy rice to feed them, and the other side, we were on the militancy, struggle against oppressive regime, martial law.
The friction between the planters and the church worsened when Pope John Paul II visited Bacolod City in 1981. His message was of social inequality, a point which some planters took with a certain degree of personal offense.
Injustice reigns. Some groups hold most of the wealth and power, while large strata of the population cannot decently provide for the livelihood of their families. The Church will not hesitate to take up the cause of the poor and to become the voice of those who are not listened to when they speak up, not to demand charity, to ask for justice.
Within hours of the Pope leaving the island, one of the very top political people rang up the bishop and said, "Bishop, if that's the Pope's message, it's going to be war."
The outspoken Father Brian Gore, together with Father Neil O'Brien, a Filipino priest and 6 organizers of the Cristiano Katilingban, bore the brunt of the militarist distrust of the Catholic Church, accused of the multiple murders of Kabangkalan mayor and planter Pablo Sola and 4 others. The case of the Negros 9 dragged on for 2 years.
Not only have the international media, we had the international jurists. You couldn't have asked for a better scenario to tell your story to the world than to be accused of multiple murder. I mean, 3 priests and 6 church workers accused of multiple murder is, if you want to grab a headline, that was a good headline.
After much pressure from various governments and the international media, the Negros 9 were freed. After the international media had a feast day on the case of the Negros 9, the Sugar Island earned a spot in the cover of a weekly Asian magazine, not for its famed sugarcane, but for the infamous photo of this child, Batang Negros, or the children of Negros.
To our big surprise, that we had the gutom of the children, no? And so we didn't know that. when our attention was called, and they said, you know, you look for signs like this, you know, I don't know, I just forget the name of you know, when you are undernourished, malnourished, no? And you get big tummy, and then you have that look, and your hair turns brown. And
I was the correspondent of the Asia Week magazine for the southern Philippines. I knew that that boy was from Banago, was not from Sagay as had been claimed, no? That he was not actually a son of a sakada or a farmer, no? But rather was just, you know, one of those malnourished children.
There was massive hunger, hindi lang yung pagutom-gutom lang. It was massive hunger, gidya, kapatay gidyang mga bata.
Elsewhere away from Negros, the hacendero was accused of being oppressive, his labor system feudal and unjust. To this he answered, "What we have here is paternalism. We take care of our people. We treat them like family." In 1995, for 3 crop years, I worked as a farm manager for my father's farms. I had conflicting thoughts about the poverty I saw back then. I thought, was this some form of modern slavery? If we treated them like family, like we always say, then why was I sleeping in a bed with mattress in a room with air conditioning, while they slept on bamboo slats in a nipa hut? Why would I see the same people I grew up with as a kid still poor 20 years or so later? It's as if nothing has changed with them.
There's nothing wrong with paternalism. It doesn't tie you down. It saves you from times of hardship.
This really is a womb-to-tomb situation. Feudalism is good for Negros because this is a seasonal crop.
The hacienda system is an oppressive system. There's no dignity in an industry, really, that only allows you to work for, say, 2/3 of the year or 3/4 of the year, because that keeps you in poverty.
Remember, this was all started 1900 to 1925 when all the mills were built. By 1950, it was a new generation. The father now had 10 children, the farm was cut up. Well, the laborer, the worker, had 10 children too. You cannot divide that work that he used to do permanently, or his house, into 10 children. And therefore, you start the beginning of a social problem. Why are you going to blame that original farmer who, in all honesty, just found an opportunity to farm? So the sakadas are not exploited. They're just poor people.
Oppressive meaning it's difficult. It's difficult manual labor. Oppressive meaning at the end of the day, how much is the wage now? Is about 200, 230 pesos. And how much is that in cents, in dollars, or compared to, you know, very small. So with you compare the prices of commodities, so that's why I think of it as it. Yes, I agree. It can be oppressive because it's difficult, and then carrying those canes up there in the truck.
Ikumparar tabi sa isa ka sako sang bugas.
Abog ka ng isang sako?
Bugat sa sako.
Bugat sa sako?
Layo, hindi. Anong...
Mga kuang guro, guro sako guro.
Ang isa ka, ano nyo...
Pasang-pasaan, tunga sako guro. Tunga, bugat nila ng baibo mo. Nga tunga kay guro sako. Tunga sako, bro 20 kilos mo. Pasaan kada buwan. Isang 25 kilos kang kasi pasaan mo. O 20 na be. Tapos ang butang truck, pila ka kilo guro mga kasakay mo eh. Pila ka pinadang daan.
It's no question that loading that sugar in the hot sun is hard work. But if you pay well, What's wrong with it? We are capitalists. There's no argument. The problem is not all pay well.
As mandated by wage orders of the law, agricultural workers are to be paid the minimum daily wage, regardless of whether they are seasonal or not. But as I went around, I saw plenty of farms that still do not pay the minimum wage. Pero sa inyo, to balang away ka mo katilaw, nagdugay ka mo siya sa kampo?
May patay naman ang tagiya. Hindi kami nakasawa kay barato ang adlaw tao da.
Anong barato?
Dalang dalang adlaw ka tao daw, cinta.
Cinta? Ang inadlaw?
Cinta.
Sa subong?
Oo, cinta lang ada.
Ilang ginaganar mo siya sa kasemana?
Kasemana mamili sa 800.
800. Pila na dang sa 800? Pila nang ginagasto mo sa lawas mo?
May mga...
Kaon-kaon lang. Mga muna yun.
Pareho may mga tiyanggi nga daan. Kada puli mo kung daw kailap. Karintakas tiyanggi kang mangutang naman.
Inyo yung pagkaon diya?
Ay, yayaman may bugas. Stadium sa kada man. Sa kada man sa kontraktor bugas.
Sino gabayad sa bugas nyo? Si ginaiba na naadaan sa...
Nakunan kami sa kontraktor, baydan ng namo siya.
Pila ka nakatuig kapaskar ka?
Dugay naman pa pansuramong tagatak.
May pulo nakatuig mo?
Sarang.
Huwag ka sang gusto nga iban nga obra?
Taguro pa sarang sa ibang liburong obra kahit huwag man graduate sa high school. Graduate lang tayo, bisan kung kaya ka na ibang obra. Kaya ako na yun, tumahaw ka. Dahil, tumahaw.
Dapat niya kaldo gitu ini sa utan ng daw. Kung straight mo ba ay di po.
Ano pa pag-usan ta kay?
Mo lang galing. Ito nga yawan mo. Kung sa ato nang yay paabot man ano na. Niluto na yung utan. Mamahaw.
Maaw niya po.
For as long as the system prevents people in the farms from finding a better life, it's oppressive. If you don't provide the opportunities, then it's oppressive. You do have people saying, there is no way I'm going to allow a program that will take my laborers out of my farm because I need my laborers in order to run the farm. If you say, no, I'm not going to provide opportunities in education, I'm not going to provide opportunities for food production or for additional income, that's oppressive.
I haven't seen an oppressor, a sendero. Although people talk of oppression in Manila, so I was aware of that. So I look around and I haven't met one yet. Will you introduce me to one if you find one?
To address these social issues, the sugar industry responded in the way they knew how, by creating pro-poor programs.
This is the only industry which actually takes care of its own people. For every pickle of sugar produced, there is money set aside so that this money is going to be used in turn for socio-economic benefits of sugar workers.
What other industries has that? Is there a textile industry foundation? No. Is there a car manufacturing foundation for their workers? No.
The uniqueness of the sugar industry is that 6 months out of the year, we have work. 6 months of the rest of the year, there is no work.
Through my research on arguments whether the Negros sugar industry is feudalistic or paternalistic, oppressive or fair, I realized the volume of books and papers concluding on two major points. It is feudalistic and it is oppressive. But just like any other sugarcane producing country, just like Brazil and Thailand. First world agriculture with third world poverty in their sugarcane fields. So I ask, why can't the wages be increased?
Once you raise wages, you cannot bring them down. So once they've raised, and we now have to think precisely of the world economy. Do you know why even a company that was so satisfied with Filipino workers in Intel left the Philippines and went to China? Because China's wages are lower. And so if we increase our wages too much, a lot of our industries will become non-competitive. And more Thai sugar will find its way here. The Chinese right now still pay $2 a day of minimum wage. The equivalent of the Philippines now is about $6. Vietnam is $1 a day.
This got me thinking. Maybe the oppression lay in the wide gap between the rich and the poor, the hacendero and the farm worker. But then, are the rich solely to be blamed for this gap? Where does government play in all of these? When Marcos stepped down from power, the glory of his cronies stood still. The Negrense hacendero woke up one day, broke, heavily in debt.
President Cory Aquino,
1986 and 1987 were unstable years for the sugar industry. Farms were unproductive.
What I was not happy about, neither were the people, was we had the farmers, the laborers not given their salary for Lance, kung duman mo ito, wala ka mo nakabaton sang sweldo, anong kadugay ganito? Sa una, sang 84, 80, mga pila ka bulan? May isa ka tuig?
The farm workers suffered with the sugar industry's meltdown. No work, no production, no wages, no food on their tables.
We lost everything.
The sugar industry lost around 14 billion pesos from 1974 to 1983. The hacenderos cry, deception by Benedicto, scam from Nasutra.
This was legalized plunder because the sutra was formed precisely in order to control the buying and selling of sugar under the assumption that the government decisions would be better than private market decisions.
Though the thievery in the sugar industry was so blatant, nobody dared make a move.
During martial law, you just don't practice your rights, so you cannot really assert whatever rights you have.
I have no idea why the sugar producers, who generally are so cohesive, why they took it for so long.
Well, we couldn't do anything. How could we do anything when we were under martial law?
Of course they could have done something, but nobody had the guts, including myself.
Armed with the possibility of recovering funds that Nasutra and Philsucom cheated from them, after the EDSA revolution, the hacenderos searched for documents that can serve as evidence. They discovered boxes upon boxes of documents at the Philsucom building in Diliman, but the rooms had already been broken into and papers shredded. The sugar was selling for 41 cents per pound in the world market, but Nasutra reportedly sold Philippine sugar for 22 to 28 cents to favored buyers in a span of a few years. It was a strategy to protect the sugar industry from fluctuations in the world market. The PCGG believes that among the anomalies of the Marcos administration in the sugar industry were schemes, one of which was conversion of the export price of sugar in the Philippines from US dollars to Philippine pesos. Sometime in 1979 to 1980, Nasutra reported an average selling price of 20 US cents per pound and converted that to 200 pesos per pickle. With the rate of exchange at 7.46 to a dollar and with 139 pounds to a pickle, the total is not 200 pesos. It should have been 207.76 to a pickle. A loss of almost 8 pesos per pickle may be a paltry sum for just one planter. But this 8 pesos multiplied by the sugar export of 1979-1980 translates to hundreds of millions of pesos. Another scheme was double invoicing. One such case covered 7,540 metric tons of sugar, which was declared sold at 15 cents per pound. The total declared received by the Republic Planters Bank was $2,621,605.05 US. Another set of invoices were discovered covering the same transactions sold at 27 cents per pound. Double invoicing. The declaration of a lower buying price compared to the real selling price of sugar in the world market.
When we were dealing with the Nasutra, we would be asked to sign a ledger, and no receipts were given to us.
You must understand that sugar is a world commodity. There's not much you can hide in terms of prices, and all you'd have to do is look.
The thief's identity was now known to all, his loot exposed. But why was it doubly difficult to recover them, even if case upon case were filed? And after suffering losses in the Nasutra years, planters also faced another foe, Presidential Decree 385, which requires government financial institutions to foreclose mandatorily all sugar loans in the period of 1979 to 1985. Foreclosure meant that the planters would lose their land to the banks. The Supreme Court under Associate Justice Nocon approved the preliminary injunction issued by the trial court against foreclosure from RPB. The enforcement of the Presidential Decree 385 will sweep under the rug this iceberg of a scandal in the sugar industry during the Marcos martial law years. This, he said, we cannot allow to happen for the benefit of the future generations. All the dirty linen in the Philsucom Nasutra RPB closets have to be exposed in public so that the same may never be repeated. Sweet words indeed to the haciendero's ear. After all, it was the Supreme Court that had spoken. When the term of President Corazon Aquino was about to expire, Congress passed Republic Act 7202, or the Sugar Restitution Act. It is an act authorizing the restitution of losses suffered by sugar producers from 1974 to 1985.
This is a recognition by Congress, the highest policy-making body of the state, that the sugar industry was the victim of oppression and deceit during the Marcos administration.
The hacienderos thought that the Sugar Restitution Act would be their claim to justice. They presumed they should have been recipients of funds from the ill-gotten wealth of Marcos. These funds should have covered their losses during the Marcos regime.
Across the board, accounts of sugar planters with this government financial institution, PNB, RPB, should be recomputed at an interest rate of 12%. That would have come down from 50, 40, 30, 12% with soft payment terms like 13 years to pay.
In 1990, Roberto S. Benedicto entered into a compromise agreement with the Philippine government. Under this agreement, his residential houses and lots, aircrafts, and 22 corporations were to be released from sequestration, assets which the government considered he legitimately acquired. The government also extended absolute immunity to Benedicto and members of his family for any criminal investigation or prosecution for acts committed prior to February 25, 1986, in relation to acquisition of assets during the said period. Because of the compromise agreement of Roberto S. Benedicto and the government, there was no money to speak of anymore. In reality, the Sugar Restitution Act did not restitute the victims of the Nasutra years. Justice was served only in spirit. Debts incurred during that time are still being paid up to now. And while the sugar industry was still trying to get back on its feet from the Nasutra period, the government implemented the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program. A beneficiary is allocated and sold a piece of land not more than 5 hectares. In Negros, they get an average of 1 hectare each. The biggest irony is that the recovered assets and ill-gotten wealth by Marcos and his cronies were going to fund this program. Perhaps one of the most controversial and much publicized CARP cases in Negros is the Malaga story, an 11-year battle between Task Force Mapalad or TFM and the Malaga Multipurpose Cooperative on who shall receive 144 hectares of CARP land awarded by the courts. This led to violent and fatal dispersal by alleged private armies, a feud that left 3 persons killed, scores wounded. Over 22 years after its implementation, the program is still beset with turmoil. Though a World Bank study shows that redistribution of private land in the country has an effect in poverty reduction, the figures are minute and the effects indirect. Alberto and Nympha have 7 children. When the younger ones prepare for school in the morning, their grandmother helps in sending them off. The family wakes up at dawn and walk downhill to fetch drinking water from and bathe in a spring.
Why ka mo katilaw tanom lain nga?
Tanon?
Oo.
Wala. Hindi ka tanong ko tuloy nga wala kaya sang kundi tras ako may tubig bla.
Kay why tubig?
May tubig pero layo.
Kung sandom lang, inandom ko gid nga makatapos ang akong kabataan pag-ag-eskwela yan 3. Ganagani si Tuto nga akong bata nga tingwa kato kay bisan papano bisan sa pigado ta sa kutob sang amon masarangan tingwaan namon nga makaeskwela kamo.
Tiway kami sang dapat kay man pigado ko ba dia. Kay porti ko mahal sa mabuno. Ti tayo gud na kun di nga butang di tag isa lang ya ka bag abi. Ti perdim ko gyapon. Dito nga gan parinduhan ko na lang.
Nabayad sa inyo?
Sa kada tuig. 5,000.
5,000?
Oo. Kapor hektarya na.
4 hektarya?
Oo.
So, 7,500.
Gusto mo namon nga kami ang mag-maintenance nga hindi man kami kano kay wala kami kwarta nga gasto.
Land for the landless? Almost 170,000 hectares have been distributed by the Department of Agrarian Reform, or DAR. But why hasn't CARP worked? Especially for Alberto and Nympha and thousands of beneficiaries who now own more than a hectare of land but still remain below the poverty line.
Ang status nila worker. So as a worker, ang kinahanglan nila mga benepisyo, ang sweldo nila nga husto. Tingin mo tayo sa ilaya, from farm workers, balik ta sila sa pisante to a peasant by giving them 3 hectares of land. Tingin panubo mo naman liwat ang ilang status, hindi ba? Kasi supposed to be, ang progression ng tao is from peasant, nangin worker siya, nangin landowner siya, o nangin industrialist siya, o nangin entrepreneur siya, hindi ba? Musna.
Kung ara sa planters ang duta, tamnan tubo, mayo ang tubo sang tubo, mayong Pureza, kung hatag mo sa ERBT, ano nga tubo ang magtubo nga mayo kung wala sang igastos na.
People have to be helped and educated and supported and set up into cooperatives to be able to, planters get an advance on next year's crop. The poor don't get an advance on next year's crop. They have to live on nothing while they're waiting for next year's crop.
Nagkatugid kami na sila, kamangayo kami bulig kung paano lang kami, mabuligan nila kami.
Buligan. Hindi ka mo nung nagkadto?
Sa DAR, sa office ng DAR. Sa land bank, mapaulam nila kami. Pero galing kanya, ang hambal sa mon, antis matigayong garo mga 2 pa katuig ring ko ti 2 katuig tan lamat patigyonan nga makabulig sila taron patay na tanaya.
When you break up the farms through agrarian reform, the responsibility now falls on the shoulders of government.
They will always be dependent upon the landowner. And once you give them the land, they will always be looking at the DAR as their next landowner. That's the point why all their decisions, they are always looking at us. They always want to be nga mag-guidan sila.
It is not really hard work. It is just
proper financial management that is needed.
So the management is not so much
Not so much on agriculture, on kung manador ka na, kung saan o ka maarado.
it's in the managing.
It is in the financial management.
The law prohibits them to sell for at least 10 years. Which organized formal entity is going to lend you money when when they cannot foreclose it and sell it anyway? Now you tell me, is that because of land reform itself or the way it was implemented?
Sa amon, kung may organisasyon ka, kaintindi kaya nga kon CARP, paghatag sa duta, dapat may kapital. Kuti kami kapati, kami nga amuntan ang component sa programa, pero kabalo man tabisan ma-approve na yung budget sa nasyonal, di damo man sang atan pakadto di mo. Kag may lang na ako may organisasyon nga gaatipan paano i-process ang mga dokumento nga para maka-avail sa mga programa sa gobyerno, puti ang wala hindi ginaya ka-avail.
Why was social preparation bypassed in the program? We know for a fact that if you are given just a piece of land without any support, without the tools to make it productive, what do you do? Who works the farm? Who pulls the plow? If you go down to the fields, to the grassroots, that is what everybody is saying. That we have to have carabaos, we have to have plows, we have to have seeds, fertilizer, and capital.
Sugarcane is a plantation crop. And as a plantation crop, it needs a tractor.
Sugar was not included in land reform in Taiwan, precisely because they knew that to produce sugar at globally competitive costs, you need large tracts of land.
And to afford one tractor, you will need 30 hectares. At least 30. It can be more.
What's happening now is we're going back to carabao farming because of the area that farmers cultivate. They cannot afford to buy tractors. We're trying to form them into cooperatives.
A model farm in Kabangkalan City is the 800-hectare Hacienda Biarin, owned by the Kabangkalan Sugar Company, or Kasuko. It was one of the top sugarcane properties before its VOS, or voluntary offer to sell. Hacienda Biarin had all the elements of an ideal sugarcane farm.
Topsoil, fully irrigated, best equipment. In the middle, the sugar mill, railroads all over, the Ilog River right on the side. And if you cannot succeed there, there's no way you could succeed anywhere.
I headed to Kabangkalan with Hernani Inopre and Francisco Boyok Jr. of Kwasi, the cooperative which manages the land of the ARBs, numbering almost 1,000.
Di nang inyo.
Ini hasta na dadji sa kuno inang daga pa mo na ho ng mga kawayan na mo na sa ang boundary. Suba na damo. Amo na to liwato kadto na to sa.
Government agencies like the Land Bank, DAR, and DTI, plus a host of NGOs, gave full support to Kwasi, but the ARBs were disjointed. In the end, they leased their land to other planters, while they remained farm supervisors, even laborers.
Sa una to ipirsa mo sila mo obra. Hindi ya magobra, bahala na maglinalisay ka mo. I-threaten ka pa nga, bahala na kun binulagay ta, ibaligya namon partida na da. Kuha namon partida namon daw amo na lang ma-resort na lang dan sa amo na. Alos baw bukang bibig nila subong baw kun nag-obra ta sang una maayo. Ti tani way ta sini kag tanaw bala produkto nila. Nati nila mo nga production. Kita mo lang gani obra gyapon.
It seems that even in ARB groups, much like the rich haciendero, the Negrense trait of a man in his own little kingdom rings true. Paul Ascona, a young sugarcane planter in the south of Negros, crossed paths with the same problem.
Inorganize na mo ang tanan nga workers dire if they wanted nga sila matanom
for livelihood abi nila. And nagsugot sila, so ginbawi namon ng duta. And then ginhatag namon sila at hindi lang ko sure, I think close to 1 hectare per family ba lang. I don't know kung natuigan man gid. We found out igin pa rent naman nila sa Tagagwa. Ang ending sa tusang storya, parang awain lang disgusto, gin-rent na lang namon sila. Bali, ang amon doon, pulam namon sila, gin-rent namon sila, kintam na namon tubo. Hinimo namon to nursery.
Way before any president had implemented land reform, Ed Locsin has his own version in 1957. In exchange for a life of evangelization in the city, he sold 22 of his 145-hectare farm to his workers for 1 peso per square meter. With the help of foreign and local NGOs, his agrarian reform methods expanded into Chito Foundation, named after his deceased son. The foundation encouraged farm workers to be independent thinkers, both in their daily lives and the management of their farm.
Negros Occidental is entirely different from Oriental or Iloilo, and you cannot bring the formula for land reform from Iloilo to Negros Occidental, expect it to work? No way. It's a class by itself. They would ask my wife what name to give their children because they cannot make any decision on that. No? So they said, Nay, nanong gusto mo pangalan sa bata ko? And she would tell them, and that is how they get baptized. Changing the mentality of the people. It was very hard. For instance, they're used to living in barracks, squatting on the floor and eating. So when I provided them with a good house, with a dining table, they found it hard to eat on the table. They'd rather eat on the floor. It's been going on for generations.
The Chito Foundation organized beneficiaries into communities and provided capital for livelihood ventures. It took Ed Locsin 30 years to train them to be self-reliant. The Chito Foundation helped the workers of Hacienda Adela, owned by another family. Ver Pasete, a son of a sakada, benefited from the foundation. The mother of Ver Pasete had bigger dreams for his future, constantly forcing him to attend classes. Farm workers also have the same dreams, the same vision for their children, education as a way out of poverty. But the island's economy is not progressive enough to provide jobs to the booming population. Not everyone can be a Ver Pasete.
Sabado kag Domingo nagaayo kuya sa enkargado, no kay Maninoy kuman. Maninoy pobraha lang kuya, tag 8 pesos a day pasadto nga tsimpo para may balunon kuya magtapos ko sang akon nga kurso.
When he was a teacher, Ver composed a zarzuela based on sugar laborers' lives. The actors were real laborers.
Damo nga luha tong nang tulo kay siling na daway man sila acting rong ilay nga pagpasundayag si entablado ya kamaturan tigin padala kita sa Cultural Center of the Philippines. Ang iban to first time nga nakapa-Manila, first time nakasakay sa barko, no kay naghimo kami ngalan para sa Negros.
Ver Pasete has been the tourism officer of the city of Silay since 1994.
Kay experience ako magbugtaw ya balang farmers na nagligadya makadto sa may sa may enkargado maarima na sila ya tudloan na sila ya nga ate sige adlaw ni manghilamon ta amon abla hindi na nila ya obligasyon ang magpalibog sang inugasto ang ilay makaubra na sila ya pagka Domingo may sweldo na sila sa akon man na italam nanti pwede man ko na kay kabalo man ko na mag-manage kung paano ko na ipasunod ang obra, ang pamangkot na, ang ibayad ko din kumakwa.
Pila balayran niyo kuno?
Nang 25 plus.
1,000? Hindi niyo nakuha.
Nambalan lang kami sa assessor nga pwede lang amat-amat.
Most of the ARBs lease back their farms to the original landowners and become farm laborers.
And in the end, what happens ba? The beneficiaries end up either leasing it or losing it.
Alberto and Nympha have leased their land and now work for other farms. They earn 100 pesos a day for 3 days a week.
Gapon may obra kami, subong ay naman.
Ngaw yung obra sila.
Kay ng init bay, ti wala wala sang ilamunan, wala sang hindi katanong patlan.
If the wages does not conform with the duly approved wages, you violate. Do we go to you? Yes, we go if we conduct a general inspection. But normally, because of our diminished number in the department, we cannot go policing. It should be a self-policing. It is part of their duty to pay.
So ang workers kung matabo, mga underweight sila nga sakripisyo sila. Kuway sila choice mo. Kung hindi ka magbaton sang lubong nga sweldo din ka makadto. Tapos ang diri subong tungod nga lain-lain na ang tagiasang duta, ti maghambal karon ang gapawbra nga sinang adlaw nyo ti wala na minimum wage, underpayment na. Ti kung hindi ka da magubra maano ka.
If you're leasing land and if you're leasing it for 5 years, you'll just look at your 5-year horizon. You're not going to invest too much in or make major investments in infrastructure in the farm, major investments in irrigation, in roads to reduce your cost of transportation. So that, you have to look at a very short-term, have a short-term mentality,
We are becoming to be an industry of lessors. Now, what happens when you become an industry and the producers are usually lessors? There is an increment of expenditure is what you pay for your lease of the land. Where are you going to save? Paghugot mo sing sinturon mo, nanong himoon mo, hastang sweldo sing tao. Ang imbis pa obra mo pa, hindi mo na pagpa-obra kay your cost is going upward.
They would tell us, to tani, to waay na lang ta nag-carp, mayo pa tani, to sang una. So we have actually seen firsthand what carp in its present form has done to the supposed, I would use the term supposed, beneficiaries.
Not one of the beneficiary has paid his land tax.
The program has been in place for 20 years. It's going to go on for another 5. So 25 years. You're talking of one generation sacrificed by the program.
Unable to remit SSS and health payments on their own, thousands of ARBs like Nympha and Alberto will grow old without health, medical, disability, calamity, retirement, and death benefits.
Ang amon la utang, way namon na impasan kuan, tingob, bayad. Balay ginatong namon na. Itinag ko mo.
Bayad man sila kay tingog man natin, magkulik sila, ginapakulam na sila mo isa ta 500 pag ginapagduwa sa ilang sweldo. Magduwa kasi mana, mag-sweldo sila 1.5 plus pag ginahulam mo niglang 500. Muna. Kundi ako Manila madala po ni galing din mo changi pilapilo mo utang.
Consumo, you call it consumo, meaning how much does a family earn consume in a week? So every week we provide that for 6 months because there's no work. And that's how it has been. Because my father says, well, we owe it to them. There are laborers. We have to take care of them. We have to give them rice because there's no work. I agreed. And I said, yeah, that's so good, Dad. But then when I was assisting, I found out it was utang deducted from them. So when I would see the record, most of them were so indebted because the amount of work that they would have was not enough, the earnings, to pay for the utang that they had during the dead season.
Ay kung impasan ta na, sweldo ko sakto lang dibayad eh.
Sisa kasi man na.
Oo. Konsumo sa pagkaon?
Hilabi.
Kung bisa ka lang sa iya na, sobra 300 na naman utang.
Okay, Edgar. Ang ila sweldo gamay lang tapos ako ila hulamon, ini balanse.
Nga aga sige ka mapautang.
Di kay kani suportahon mo gini sa nimo.
Memo di mo
Kay for example, pag start sang milling, paulamon man na sila anay 500 kada isa para ibilin sila pamilya. Ubra sila de. Lain ang pamilya dire konsumuhan mo pagit sila every week dire. Ti buhinon nimo na sila utang. Kay ilang hulam atong ibilin sa pamilya amat amato to no buhin 100 every sildo na 200. Hasta maimpas ang 500 yung ibilin sa pamilya. Konsumo naman dire every week mapadala pa sa pamilya nila. Gamay ang ilang income, dako ang ilang gasto, kung damo kabataan. May lang konsultiro bala.
Sebagay yan niya, amo ning obrato mo ning plaka masusundong. Gabi ko nga budlay, kapag gisulih mo. Kaya ito yung bullpen ginayata niya, kung naman, giskulahan niya mo.
Ti may ara subong ni ho ang sulilduhan namon sa Biyernes ni ho 900 man lang. Taga mo lang na. Ti desong ko may utang kundi gay nang kongkista may nagamasakit ang mga bata namon. Makautang kami to sa amon amo ti nang ang 900 na asildo. Hawiran pa na sa amon utang kisa naga ano na lang mga 700 mga amon na lang na. Pakal ka man sa amon nga bugas, ang amon sudan. Lang amon pa yung ginagawi sa sulod balay. Deson kung hindi kami kabakal nagapangutang kami sa Tiangge.
Mercelina's children could not find jobs in Negros, so they left for Manila.
Anong last mo obra?
Mas ko bali ano lang yung contractual, 5 months.
Dason, so wala na.
Wala na, nagpuli ko sa Negros.
Nagpuli ka?
Oo.
Nagano ka to?
Nagpakasal. Gusto, tayo mo na nagpakasal kami anay. Tapos pagka bata sana, before ko din nagkadto. Pag peak season, mga bare months, budlay mag-apply bra kay gakon sila mga seasonal lang. Kaya full ang mga lubrahan.
Wala to chance nga makita mo yung obra sa Negros. Kung dito ka, wala ka chance ang magasinso.
Tawad ka?
Wala ka man tinapusan. Kung may tinapusan ka, siguro may chance pa. Sa kayang si tita namon, gamistrada sa sa Kalayaan. Kilalaya ang canteen manager. Patigayon niya ko. Bulig luto sa cook sa canteen. Start kami 6 o'clock, tapos magawa kami 5:30.
So halos 12, 11 hours?
11,
May lunch break di ka mo?
May lunch break. Kay maluto ka man akong mga cook food sa mga estudyante.
Eva left her family in Negros. She is now a teacher in Manila. Mercelina's children live with her.
Sakada is a person that looks for work elsewhere because he cannot make it in his own place. How many sakadas do the Philippines have outside this country right now? If there is a comparison that has to be made. How many sakadas? 8 million? I think that's the latest figure I got, 8 million, maybe more. 8 million sakadas. And we talk about sakadas, you talk about doctors who have become nurses because they cannot be accepted. They are overqualified, but engineers.
We looked for Moroy's eldest son, Giovanni, in Bulacan. He works with his cousin delivering chickens all over Luzon. I was surprised to see a familiar face. Moroy's friend back in Hacienda Chiquita, Edgar. He worked as a sakada in Tuguegarao, a province all the way in northern Luzon.
Makakakita ko brate, dugay bukan brate. Puli siya na Negros. Kung kita ko brate, dugay gini. Na gusto ko ng puli, nidlaw ko
But the social issues of wages of farm workers are nothing compared to what the sugar industry is about to face in 2015. The AFTA deadline for 0 to 5% tariff on sugar. The Philippines is a member country of the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, or AFTA. A free trade area would allow industries and companies within the ASEAN region to take advantage of the economies of scale. By 2015, imported sugar will enter Philippine shores tax-free. Local sugar must compete with these cheap imports. For the sugar industry to survive, sugarcane producers and agricultural agencies have to find ways to lower production costs.
In most countries, it is the people in the industry that are represented when they look for negotiation on tariff. In our case, we were assured by government that the Department of Agriculture is going to protect the industry or negotiate for us.
As sugar, we are DTI. As sugar cane, we are DA. DA does not also understand sugar.
And this is what happened. We have one of the lowest in tariff and highest in the reduction rate.
Other AFTA countries have set tariffs to protect their local sugar production.
Tariff is reasonable if there is really basis for saying that an industry is still at an infant stage, that you cannot force the Davids to compete with the Goliaths. And that was true after the Second World War, when we were still beginning most of our industries from scratch.
I think the negotiation when we started should have been negotiated by the producer of the product, because who else could protect your product than you yourself?
Marojas was a former DTI head, and we had a relationship with him. And he was the chief negotiator. My stand there was give us 10 years, which is 2010. And he did. We should be competitive by now, but we are not.
When government talks about subsidies or support for the agriculture sector, they'll think first about rice and corn, and then coconut and fisheries. In other words, the small farmers, the small growers, etc. Sugar is less attractive to government at this point in time as a sector that needs strong support.
Number one, it's really the policy of government. Cheap food. Cheap food. That is the biggest deterrent to investment in agriculture. For them, it's convenient to bring in food from outside.
You want bigger prices so that your inefficiencies will be compensated for.
Every time the consumer buys mahal na sugar, he is subsidizing you.
There's nothing like trade, as long as it's fair trade, to get people off their backs and start becoming competitive. It's been shown all over the world. And this mga, you've got to protect the sugar. Who did you protect? Who did you protect?
I don't think you can refer to the sugar industry as an infant industry. It's more than a century old, no? And so they have to be able to compete with the sugar industries of our neighbors.
Protection is very, very specific parameters. Protection for infant industry, that's only for infant industry until they're up there and ready to compete. But if as a result of the protection they remain infants for the rest of their lives, you didn't protect anybody.
There is still little realization of the fact that 90% of the industry is small farmers, 10 hectares or less. In fact, 85%, 5 hectares or less. So the government does need to change its attitude about the sugarcane grower.
Ang hasyenda nagagamay mo. Like for example, sa Hacienda Adela, mga 110 hectares na. Subong pila ng tagiya, mga 4-5 gina-divide na. Ang tawo ya gadamo. Sang una mga pila lang kami man, 200, 300. Subong gadamo na kami kayo. Hindi na naiya kamo ma-akomodar sang hasyenda, sang duta. Hindi na. Kag mga kabataan, subong niya mamuling tubo, hindi na magkapot sa dol, kaya may computer na. Huya na sila magguna.
It's only in Negros that the livelihood of almost the entire island is based on sugar.
So if you don't protect our sugar industry, the effect is dual. One, there are 4 to 5 million people dependent on the industry. That's the size of Singapore.
Makes no sense to me why a government implements a program like CARP, which basically splits agricultural land into many small parts, and then signs a free trade agreement, which forces these small farms to compete against big farms in first world countries. It's insane. Either our government didn't know what they were doing, or they just don't care. In the ASEAN region, our biggest competitors are the Thais. Together with India, Thailand's young sugar industry is now considered one of the top producers in the world.
The Thais were very competent in providing their farming sector with farm-to-market roads, irrigation systems, post-harvest facilities. Thailand is always cited as the best agribusiness country because while we were still obsessed with steel, petrochemicals, and so on and so forth, they were busy endowing their countryside with infrastructures. And that made their farmers very productive.
The Asian Free Trade Agreement will bring down tariff for importing sugar to the Philippines by 2015. If this tariff is between 0 to 5%, this means that Thailand can bring in their sugar virtually tax-free. If Thai sugar is almost half the price of our local sugar, how can we compete with it?
We're in a bit of a time warp here in terms of the industry. I think that this industry needs to consider other revenue streams. Right now, it makes sugar and sells molasses. I've always had the concept of Negros as being kind of this power island.
The mills in Negros are old. You won't see a nice brand new, sparkling brand new purpose-built mill of a large capacity. Mostly the mills are old. They've been here for decades and decades, and they've been added onto here and there, and the capacities have been brought up. So they're not nice, neat new mills. I think in the Philippine context, if there's a new project, the assumption is the mill will put up the money that will be needed to put a project in, whether it's cogen or ethanol or even a mill improvement project. Only get 35% or 30% of the benefit. And that's the main reason why the mills are not in particularly good shape.
When the Thais came and we showed them our cane carrier, we wanted to expand from 6,000 to 9,000, 10,000. But we were afraid that through that cane carrier, we wouldn't be able to pass more than 6,000 tons. And they said, no, you can pass 9,000 tons through that same cane carrier without doing much. They proved it. In other words, we had all of these blinders. It's not that we haven't been going elsewhere to borrow technology. It may have been believe sa sarili.
Now you have to get out and you've just got to fight and start becoming independent and start realizing that there's a world there beyond sugar.
Over the years, have the hacienderos looked into this world beyond sugar? Why haven't they diversified into other crops?
You know, we tried everything from rambi to hemp.
We planted cacao, we planted coconut.
150 hectares of mechanized corn with pioneer people coming here and Americans all over the place.
We also planted guava, cashew.
I tried white bean combination with corn. White bean that we brought in from Idaho, we had experts around.
I don't really know how people can talk about diversification. I know this for a fact because I was part of it. I couldn't succeed in making it break even.
Either if you grow vegetables, they will spoil, so your spoilage rate is 30%. Because we're too far from the market, we're not Thailand where you load it on your truck and you're in Bangkok. Here you load it on a vessel, the vessel is delayed, oops, there's a typhoon, sorry, the vessel will stay 4 more days at port. By the time your whole vegetable package goes to Manila, forget it, you've lost most of the crop.
When you market a perishable item, you expect to get only 20% of its value because they will say that they're not sure that they can sell it on time and get 40%. So they're willing to take a chance by giving you 20% of the value.
They will say, oh, you can solve that refrigeration. Well, refrigeration is very expensive. Sugar, you don't need refrigeration. You don't need fancy vessels. You don't need anything. It's a preservative by itself. So the so-called post-harvest losses don't exist in sugar. We can produce many things out of sugarcane. In fact, sugarcane is now the Niño Bonito of all crops. worldwide. Cogeneration is no longer a byproduct bagasse, which used to be really a waste product long time ago. It is now a co-product, so we can power our own. That's diversification to me. Producing ethanol is diversification. Downstream products from ethanol.
If you look at the production, all the world is going into integration and we are going into divisions. You put up an ethanol plant, it will cost you during about 3 years ago or 4 years ago about 1.5 billion pesos. That's about 150,000 liters a day ethanol plant. If you put it in the Philippines, then you will need about 6,000 hectares. Now, if you put it in the Philippines, you need the raw material. You have to talk to about 4,000 planters for you to be supplied with the raw material. If you go to Indonesia, you talk to 12 people, they could supply it. If you go to Brazil, you talk to 3 people, they could supply that. Now, if you're an investor, where are you going to go?
My father used to tell me, planting sugar has a 7-year cycle. You'll have one bad crop year, 1 year where you'll get hit by a typhoon, maybe another year where the prices suddenly dip, and the rest of the years, you make money. But good or bad year, most hacienderos refuse to adjust. After all, he was born privileged. For generations, he has led the most comfortable of lifestyles. This is the culture of the haciendero.
I tell you, sugar is very sweet. How come we forget so fast? That's why addiction has something there. It makes you forget. What it does, it blinds you, it lulls you. And you're not even aware, or you're not even conscious, or you're not even in pain or discomfort. That's why we say you're laid back.
In Negros, basta mapisan ka lang, hindi ka gid magutman. We say nga mahapos because sugarcane is a variety of grass.
And what is sugarcane? Sugarcane is grass. For heaven's sakes. I mean, what's so difficult about growing sugarcane? We had a soil for it.
Ubra ka 6 ka bulan, 8 ka bulan, then hulat ka. Okay. That's why I always called sugarcane as a lazy man's crop.
Itanong mo, abonuhan mo lang sa gusto. Keep the fields free from weeds. God will do the rest for you.
Atong lang ang mentality nga dado ka laid back nga patawhay.
Bisa nagahinubog ka di adlaw-adlaw ka kalamang ka na sa kanal ya, sige tubo to ya sang imo tubo ya. It is, I will admit, it is a lazy man's crop. That's why ang mga taga Negros nagtinamad.
Sugal, inom. Well, maybe ang naghatag sila ng kultura ang mga amo man lang.
You know, Padre, ini mga akong mga tinao, tamaran gid, kawatan pa, kapaluhubog. Buti? Where do you think they learned that from?
Kung damo kirida to ang amo niya, mangirida man siya. Katos pulangan. Kato mas pulangan. Kato ganis tuto.
It's their image of what it means to be a man.
Ever since before, when I was vice governor, Bitay was governor, and we talked about rehabilitation program for Negros, people said, you know, they would look at you with some amount of disdain and say, well, don't you think you had it coming? You know, and the lack of willingness to help the sugar industry because, you know, we were the spoiled brats and we deserve whatever problems we had coming.
There is what we always say, that we are what our past has made of us.
We forgot that we were once the best sugarcane planter in the world.
May Marie has her own dead season. During school vacations, she has no work. Ryan has found a job as a night shift operator for a school's printing shop. He gets to send money to his family in Negros. he hopes to find a regular job. When we went back to visit Nympha and Alberto at La Castellana, they weren't home. Nympha and her eldest son were at the hospital in the city of Bacolod, 2 hours away from their place. Her grandchild was sick. Alberto was busy looking for friends to loan money from. Nympha and Alberto still earned barely enough for their family. They had added another 3 years to the lease of their land just to pay off the hospital bill of their grandchild. Gina Bautista Martin is the first female SRA administrator in the male-dominated sugar industry. After a year in office, she now regards the 2015 scenario from a business management standpoint. Her proactive solution: improve and develop the sugar industry through efficiency. And this she plans to do by relying on a few honest people in government and enabling stakeholders to do their share towards a common goal. December. When I visited Moroy, his team had only cut less than half of their usual weekly truckloads. Mills were closed for the holidays. Moroy had to look for temporary work elsewhere.
Ayaw mo lang kay gito na libra mo. Pati bigado ang daan dito. Dako man po tayong puli, galing heter nun mo kay waita ko pa. Nangalang.
Ano na nga nagalang-alang ka mo?
Yung plite mo, no? Hindi, plite prato lang to. Kung balik di, kaya naman mo.
Galalain ka?
Sa bagay tani eh. Parang kapulit pa nita, nangalang man parang pulit akong mait ka yung plite. Anong bigyan naman daan kabataan, takay pas pa nga daan subong.
When I asked my uncle Nene Abelio, one of the most efficient and respected sugarcane farmers in Negros, if he could compete with Thai sugar habitually and illegally dumped into our country, he answered, no, the math just doesn't make it possible. His answer was a surprise for me. I go around his farm, it's the most ideal I've seen. I'd say his farm is globally competitive. For this film, I flew above Negros Occidental twice, 1 year apart, and I saw a majority of farms that clearly cannot compete in the global arena. The problems that beset the Negros sugar industry have been here for decades. These problems are not only of the rich hacendero or the poor farm worker. The other players of the game, the millers, the traders, government agencies, the ARBs, they too are part of the industry. In 5 years, the inevitable can happen. The sugar in Moroy's plate may be from cane grown in foreign lands, not from the cane his hands toiled on. And this is a future that surely the Negros sugar industry shouldn't consider. Time and time again, the smartest, most educated minds from government and planter organizations have analyzed these problems and proposed solutions. For almost 3 years, I've interviewed over 150 people in Negros. They not only know the problems really well, they also know the solutions to each and every problem. But sadly, for the past 3 decades, it seems nothing has changed.